Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Girt Up podcast. My name is Charlie Ungemak. I'm the host and founder and curator of Girt Up. Very excited to have you here. We've got a guest today. It's going to be a lot of fun and very interesting. But before we get there, please consider helping us do the work that we do here at Girt Up by making a cup of coffee donation. We call it a cup of coffee because for the price of a cup of coffee, $5, you can help support that we're doing here at Girt Up as we flood the internet with confessional content and help prepare the people of God for whatever lies ahead. You guys and your support has paid for most of this equipment, which we're very, very thankful for, the fancy microphones we use and all that kind of stuff, and all kinds of other opportunities and things like that. So we pray that you would, that the Lord would continue to provide for us through you, because it really is you guys that are making all this happen. Thank you to those of you who have donated already. Again, I'll put those links down in the show notes below, including any links that Professor Otto would like to add after we're done recording as well. So you can find all the information you need to follow us, to make donations, or to follow any of those links down in the show notes below. Professor Dean Otto, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks, Charlie. Thanks for having me on.
And welcome back to the U.S. You were abroad somewhere. Where'd you just get back from?
I was in Lusaka, Zambia for close to a week.
Okay.
I just got back Saturday.
What are you doing in Lusaka?
I was there for face-to-face meetings of the Confessional, Evangelical, Lutheran Conference Theological Commission. I know it's a lot of words there. The Confessional, Evangelical, Lutheran Conference is this federation of Lutheran church bodies around the world. There's like 30 plus. A lot of them are missions that were started, or church bodies that were started by mission work of either the WELS or the ELS. So we gathered there. It's kind of, we meet face to face a year ahead of the Triennial Convention, and the Triennial Convention is next year in Lusaka. So, and one of the guys in our commission actually was from Zambia. So, but we had a guy from Germany, a pastor from Latvia, and a few of us from the U.S. So.
It's awesome. Why meet in Zambia, of all places?
Because next year the Triennial Convention will be held there. So it was kind of an advance meeting.
Yeah.
See where we're... Professor Nass, who's the president, I got to see where the convention's probably going to be held. And
okay.
That kind of thing.
Is it a convenient place for a convention like that to be held? Like in my mind that I know I'm not alone, you say Lusaka, Zambia, and I imagine, like huts and things. Is that what it's really like over there?
Lusaka is a modern city by most standards. Fairly large. It's the capital of Zambia. It's actually kind of nice because the airport there is kind of like the Milwaukee airport. You zip right through, not real busy and that kind of thing. But it does take several connecting flights to get there. But the church bodies in Africa will appreciate the proximity. Those folks in Asia and United States will have to go through a little more.
But it's an
travel.
Adventure.
It is.
It's an adventure.
It's about 30 hours worth of travel adventure to get there. So.
Where do you connect to when you're flying?
This time I went through Chicago to Ethiopia, and I always forget the name of the city there, and then from there to Lusaka. On the way back, we had to take a pit stop in Rome to fuel up because you're flying against the jet stream. You can't make it all the way there in one shot. So, but yeah.
When you say pit stop, you're saying stay on the plane and everything? Or?
Literally, yeah, we stayed on the plane. They gassed up, brought a new crew in, and I think we were on the ground for maybe an hour. Never left the plane.
Yeah. Is this something you get to do often?
It's my second time to Lusaka. I was there back in 2014 to teach a class for 2 weeks. But this is I'm new on this commission, so this is my first face-to-face meeting.
Yeah.
So yeah,
it's exciting.
Yeah, it is. It was fun to be with some brothers from other parts of the world, and some guys I've known. It's interesting. The German pastor, Jonas Schrader, was my junior year. He was like the Benny Hook. our year. He spent a year with us studying here on campus, and so I hadn't seen him really other than on a couple of Zoom meetings. I hadn't seen him since 1992.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah,
very cool. Now you are the Dean of Students at Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary, and professor of Well, what all do you teach? I have you for church history. What all are you a professor of?
I primarily teach church history.
Okay.
Technically, I'm on the education department. I'm in the education department too, but I haven't been teaching much in that department. I help out with supervising Midler second-year students teach catechism class. I've taught that class in the past a couple of times. I used to teach part of the senior education class, but Professor Paul Waldschmidt does that now. Technically, I'm actually the chairman of the department, of the education department, but for whatever that means, it doesn't mean a lot. And I've got a winterim class I teach as well in education. So
awesome. And before that, you served as a pastor.
Yes. I was graduated from the seminary in 1995. Served 1 year in Midland, Michigan, Good Shepherd Lutheran. I was assigned as the assistant to the district president. Back then, that was kind of like a tutor call. It could be a 1 year or 2 years out. And after 1 year, I got reassigned to First German Lutheran in Manitowoc. And I served there for about 5 years until 2001 when I took a call to San Diego, Reformation Lutheran. I was there for about 5 years. And then in 2006, I accepted a call to Trinity Lutheran in Minocqua, Wisconsin. You can question my sanity for leaving San Diego to go to Minocqua if you'd like. I always say I traded palm trees for pine trees and no winter for really long winter. But it was... all those places have been fun to serve. I mean, Minocqua, well, half of Illinois goes up there in the summer, so, for good reason. And then in 2011, I was called to teach here, and so I've been here for 14 years, which makes me one of the grizzled veterans on the faculty here. But
have you been dean of students the whole time?
No, I picked up those duties in I think it was 2016. Professor Brenner had been doing that for over 20 years, and he decided to step back from that for the last which was kind of nice. It allowed me to work into that while he was still around, and then he retired, I think, in 2020.
Yeah. All right, cool. As a parish pastor, how do you end up on a list of candidates for a position like church history professor?
That's a good question. Somebody submits your name to the nomination list, because when calls like this go out, there's basically an email or whatever goes out. It gets put out to the synod. Anybody can nominate whoever they want. There's criterion, of course, if it's a pastor or teacher or whatever. And so a list gets compiled, and sometimes it's really long and sometimes it's not as long. But I think the list I was on had like 50 names. I was kind of shocked when I got the call from President Paul Wentland. I still remember actually when I got the phone call, because I didn't recognize the number, so it went to voicemail. Plus, I was visiting. You'll appreciate this. I was visiting a member.
Millie? No.
I was visiting a different member who was a Chicago Bears fan, and offering my condolences after the Packers beating the Bears to go to the Super Bowl back in 2011, so January 2011. So
I remember that game for sure.
I was taking in, offering my pastoral counseling for him.
Awesome. Love that. That's funny. So you weren't writing papers about church history or anything like that?
I had written a symposium paper in 2005 on the Augsburg Confession and Lutheran worship. I had written a paper back in 2000 when it was the 150th anniversary of our synod on how the break with the Missouri Synod moved the WELS forward in Christ. So I always had an interest in history and church history. So I had a couple of projects like that I had done, and so somehow that got some people's attention, I guess.
Yeah. And you certainly appear to have jumped into the identity of, seminary historian and so forth with both feet. Something you're clearly enthusiastic about.
Oh yeah, and you kind of have to when you get a call like this. It's a very niche, narrow kind of call, so that kind of becomes your focus. When you're a parish pastor, you're very much a generalist, but you can still have some interests in different things for sure. And I'd always, like I said, enjoyed history, and it kind of shows up when you look at the transcripts from college, and I took all three Professor Deutschlander history electives and 2 Professor Korthal's history electives, so I kind of piled up on those, and I'm sure they caught somebody's attention along the way somewhere too.
Yeah. So like the study of history is obviously not a rare thing, although perhaps not as common as it has been in the past, which maybe is ironic that historically we studied history more. But I think in our circles specifically, as Lutherans, and I mean, you look kind of over at the Missouri Synod side too. You have a lot of people very passionately interested in the history of particularly Lutherans in America, but then also as far back as the Reformation, like there have been Lutherans. But there seems to be a greater emphasis, and this is anecdotal, obviously, but there seems to be a much greater emphasis in specifically confessional Lutheran circles on a study both of like ancient church history, so the church fathers and so forth, but then also in our own, it makes sense that we'd study Reformation history. It's kind of a given. Although I maybe wouldn't need to be, because you don't seem to see the same emphasis or even awareness in like Calvinist and Reformed circles. Not that there isn't anyone studying history there, but it is such a point of emphasis, even as far down as our catechesis, but certainly at the pastoral level and at the collegiate level, any institution in our midst that is affiliated with our church body is emphasizing these things, which seems to be a unique character trait of Lutheranism in general. Why do you think that focus exists?
I think maybe one reason is if you take it back to the Reformation, Luther, Melanchthon, their interest in education, particularly that Renaissance humanism emphasis on going back to the sources, I think that just engendered an interest in history. And so his study of history was always going to be an emphasis in educational circles among Lutherans. As Lutheranism developed, and their educational systems developed throughout the 16th, 17th centuries, history was always an emphasis. And so when you come to America, and particularly the confessional Lutheran church bodies had an interest in continuing that kind of educational legacy and understanding the importance of it. I would say also in some ways, we always see history as, it's God's story, all right? It's God continuing to work through his reign, work to gather his elect through the gospel, and everything that he rules and lives and reigns. You think of the end of the prayer of the day. He lives and reigns over all things. Well, Jesus is ruling all things for the good of his church, and so that story. Seeing that continue and appreciating God's grace working in history for us. And so I think that's maybe one big reason why we kind of just see the continuity of, we see the beginnings of church history, you might say, in the book of Acts, and now that continues over the last 2,000 years. I think another reason that Lutherans were always interested in the confessional Lutherans was the desire to help people see we are not some new thing, that we are in the continuity of the larger church. Rome was always accusing Lutherans of being this radical new group, and Luther's Reformation has sometimes been termed a conservative Reformation because we were not trying to completely throw out everything from the past. And in fact, sometimes trying to go out of our way Lutherans going out of their way to make those connections to the past. So you see quotes from the church fathers in the Lutheran confessions. You see a guy like Chemnitz who did a deep dive into the church fathers, always trying to provide evidence from the church fathers that bolstered the Lutheran doctrine. And says we're not teaching anything new here. First of all, it always goes back to Scripture, but there have been others along the way, and Augustine and Ambrose, any others that you might find along the way that show that what we're teaching has been taught before. So
Yeah.
I think those are some reasons. History in general, yeah.
Yeah. So maybe just put it in simplest terms. The Lutheran Church is very intentional about, and has been from the beginning, about tying its teachings to the historic teaching of the church.
Correct. Which I'd say is why, in our worship, why do we confess the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed regularly? Oh, and by the way, 1,700 years Nicene Creed, or Council of Nicaea this year.
Okay.
Sort of a history fact for you. fact, I think even this month, the council was meeting 7 years ago. So I think, I think you hit it right on the nose. Yeah, that's one big reason.
American Christianity almost seems, when you were talking about the idea of this being a new thing, in American Christianity, I think it seems to me that we're kind of in that situation again, where we appear to be the new thing to a lot of like American evangelicals, or just like that, however you might classify them, like the non-denominational world. And even you go into the Bible Belt and some of those areas, we are seen as like the new kid on the block, the new thing sometimes. How do you explain who we are and what we are to somebody that has no understanding of why we are the way that we are, where we came from?
Well, I think that's, again, where the study of history can be so helpful, is helping people see the fact that we're a 175-year-old church body, if you're going to talk narrow WELS, that's, perspective, right? In the perspective of the large Christian church, not even a tenth. Perspective of Reformation history, 500, third, 40%, something like that. But when you talk about Lutheranism in America, I would argue that only the Missouri Synod is older than we are, as far as being able to still, a church body that still has its identity and can trace its history back to its founding and hasn't been swallowed up in all sorts of different mergers and amalgamations and everything like that, that we've retained. We can say, yep, 1850, May 26th at Salem Lutheran Church. That's when the Wisconsin Synod was founded, and that history has continued. So we aren't some new kid on the block, I think, is helping people. I think that's why an anniversary like this can be helpful.
Yeah.
To provide some resources to help people see we aren't this new we aren't so new, even though the gospel always, it is a new song we sing, right? That God would save us by grace alone. But I think from that perspective, we aren't some new thing, and we have some roots. And I feel like people are looking for that more these days. That's where when you talk about a lot of the non-denominational group, they go back as far as their founding pastor, who might have been born in 1990. Whereas, we've got some roots and some history, and some of it very fascinating history, in my opinion.
And you kind of got to this already, but I'm going to ask the question anyway because I like it. You talk about resisting all the mergers and things like that, and retaining our specific identity as something independent, as if it's a good thing. Why is it a good thing? Why is there value in that?
First of all, from a doctrinal standpoint, because so many of the mergers that occurred, it was a watering down of doctrine. You end up least common denominator, and so what ends up, so much of the truth gets lost and gets watered down, and we can agree to disagree or whatever. And so that's why you end up, merger, and you end up with the ELCA, which is kind of doctrinally adrift, to say the least. And so I think that God has, in his grace, preserved us from a lot of that. And there are several times in our history where that could have gone in a whole lot different direction, but didn't, by God's grace. That's actually going to be kind of a theme I'm going to have. I'm currently working on writing the Synod Convention essay for this summer, and I'm going to be following that line a little bit through my essay.
Yeah, but by his grace.
God's surprising grace to the Wisconsin Synod.
Yeah. This is I posed a similar question to Dr. Kolb a few months ago. Why is it important that the Lutheran Church still exists? Because you see and you've alluded to this a couple of times, you just see all the lines being blended and blurred. And I think there's a part of just about anybody that says, why can't we just be united, right? Wouldn't it be nice to just have one Christian church? I was at Fiddleheads this morning. There's a guy sitting at the next table also reading his Bible, right? Mm-hmm. We're at two different, and we're not going to go to church together on Sunday. So I assume, maybe he was a Lutheran guy, but I assume he wasn't. Wouldn't it be nice to just say, we're Christians. Christian is Christian, period. Why do we need to preserve the labels?
The short answer is because the presence of sin and the devil in the world has brought about division and has brought false teaching. The devil's always trying to attack the truth, in particular the truth of how we are saved. It is part of our natural sinful condition to think I have to and I can do something to save myself. So you look at every religion other than biblical Christianity is always a religion of works. And almost every false teaching that has crept into the church has with maybe a few exceptions, has attacked that central core teaching in some way or another, maybe sometimes more subtly than others, but somehow attacked that teaching that we are saved entirely by God's work alone, through Christ alone, received by faith alone, which is also a gift of the Holy Spirit. All that it all comes down to God's action, God's work. And I think that's a distinctive that confessional Lutheranism brings to the table in American in the American Christian scene, or even in the world scene for that matter. That voice that unapologetically and unflinchingly holds to the truth of that it's Scripture alone, even if my reason doesn't always grasp it all. That this reveals that we are saved by grace alone, completely God's kindness to us that we deserve in no way, shape, or form. God's grace that was revealed in Christ, who has done everything for us from beginning to end. I mean, you even think from eternity to eternity, it's entirely God's work and it centers in Christ, and that we receive that by trusting in Him for our salvation. I just think that message is unique. And a message that and a voice that needs to be heard. It's a voice that brings comfort and peace and hope to a world that, well, you look around us today and seems to be often spinning out of control.
Yeah. You kind of alluded to the idea that there are doctrines being taught by churches that, for lack of a better way of saying this, preserve the Christianity, but subtly insert works righteousness. Can you just give an example of that?
I mean, maybe a less subtle one is probably Roman Catholicism. I think most people would point out quickly that there it's faith plus works, and their definition of faith is often a little bit different. Mm-hmm. Generic American evangelicalism.
Well, to your Catholic point, the thing that has shocked me the most about working with Mormons is just how closely, with very different language, just how closely Mormon doctrine actually mirrors Catholicism. That they are very, very close in their, not in their like
word stuff.
Right. And certainly not, although even that, some of it, I mean, like their teachings about the Trinity and so forth are not the same. But as far, like practically speaking, the religion is very, very similar in the rites and the rituals and the tradition and the role that they all play, and even the leaders who speak for you and things like that. It's surprising and even a little shocking just how close they are.
Yeah,
You're fine.
It is kind of, I know the devil only has so many ways he can spruce things up. I don't know. Yeah, the living voice of the church kind of idea, that the Pope is infallible, can say, and can create new doctrines if he wants, and so can whoever is leading the Mormon church.
Mm-hmm, yeah. And
I was going to say another more subtle one, of course, in America, generic American evangelicalism, decision theology, that the one thing you have to do is believe, make that decision for Jesus, surrender, however that gets worded, with always the implication that it's something you have to be in, you have to do yourself. It's that emotional experience that you're looking for. And in some ways they end up in the same place as Catholicism too. Because it all comes back to, it's something you've got to do. And then it becomes a matter of sanctified living proves that I made that decision. And so where do I go to find comfort? Then I have to go and look at myself. Am I living the kind of life that I should be living? Rather than Lutherans tend to point people outside of ourselves to the promises of God, to the sacraments, to what God is doing for me, not what I'm doing for Him.
Yeah. So connecting this all the way back to where we started here, I heard it said once, and I think he's right. I don't even remember who said it. If you are the guy that said it, thank you. But I heard somebody make the case once, and I think they're right, that the Lutheran Church's identity has always been the Catholic Church in exile, right? The true Catholic Church in exile. That what the Catholic Church claims to be is the one true Christian church through the ages, all the way back to Christ and the earliest apostles. And you can make the argument, maybe they were, for a time at least. And then when the giant cruise ship that is the Catholic Church veered off course, they no longer were the true Christian church. And so the Lutheran Church is a restoration of what went wrong in the Catholic Church and then a continuation on that path. And the case he was making is the moment that we as Lutherans forget that we are the true Lutheran or the true Catholic Church in exile, we've lost our identity and lost our reason for existing. What do you think about that?
I have heard us referred to as, I would say, evangelical Catholics or Catholic evangelical.
Which just makes it even more confusing.
You can kind of say either one.
Yeah.
I mean, because of our emphasis on the gospel, but our also desire to see this fact that we are this continuity we have to the past, and that we aren't throwing everything out just because it looks Catholic, it looks Romish. And I think that was always I think it shows up in what Lutheran worship has typically looked like. That desire to say we're not throwing the liturgy out, we're not throwing out the lectionary, all those things like that, just because it looks like Rome. But recognize, and again, the teachings, of course, are the most important thing, but having that kind of mindset, I think, is a big part of that.
Yeah. So the history of the American church is a fascinating one for all kinds of different reasons, and you can almost make the case that the history of Lutheranism in America really isn't the same history as the American church at large.
Right. I would agree.
Yeah. Because you have essentially, especially with the Missouri Synod, and it's difficult, especially in the early years, you can separate the people, but the teachings, it's hard to separate, the different Lutheran churches, especially in the Midwest, from each other in a good way. The Lutheran Church showed up as an established church, arrived on the frontier out here essentially as an established church, which is different than the odd ducks getting pushed out of England and the Netherlands and places like that. So like the Pilgrims, for example, are a good example of a small sect that got pushed out really for political reasons and is looking for a place to practice freely. Their approach to religion and approach to organization even and government and so forth is going to be very different than a group of people who, again, especially considering the Missouri Synod, but then also the Wisconsin Synod, showing up in the Americas and saying, well, we already are a church and we're just here now. Those are two very different histories. Do you mind first just talking a little bit about like why did the Lutherans end up here? Because there were Lutherans here already on the East Coast.
Yep.
And they then ended up being Lutherans out here who decided not to be closely associated with the Lutherans over there and were loosely affiliated with the Lutherans back home in Germany and Norway and places like that. Can you just give us a brief history of the Lutheran Church in America, I guess?
Oh, that's a brief history, sure.
It's a huge question.
This is what you cover your senior year, first semester for about 60% of the class, senior year class is Lutheranism in America. I mean, part of it is, what brings Germans and Swedes and Norwegians and so on to America. Already they're coming, the earliest were coming already in the mid 1600s, but they're looking for opportunity. They're looking, economic opportunity often. Sometimes they're looking for a little more political freedom. Some, frankly, were probably coming to escape being cannon fodder in wars. If I come here, I'm not going to get drafted into the military. There were a few who did come over for religious reasons. Those who formed the Missouri Synod, a group of them had come over to and settled in Missouri because they were trying to get away from the state church back in Germany that was trying to force Lutherans and Reformed together, that union kind of idea. A lot of those who came to Wisconsin in the mid 19th century were coming, I would say mostly for economic reasons. there wasn't as much land available in Europe. There's a whole lot of land available in America. And so that's, I think, what's bringing a lot of people over here, a lot of Germans, particularly in Wisconsin. In 1848, it becomes a state. There's a lot of land available, a lot of opportunities for that, for a new life. And so they come with their religion, and some are, that state church idea mentality back in Germany. Okay, I'm Lutheran, so I'm going to get somebody Lutheran here. Where's the nearest Lutheran church? Sometimes there wasn't one. There weren't enough pastors often, and you had a couple of different brands of Lutheran, over here. And the Eastern Lutherans, like you mentioned, have been here for a while, but there were some in the East, especially out of Gettysburg Seminary, who were trying to push Lutheranism to accommodate American Christianity, particularly the growing Methodism and those kinds of that kind of Christianity, which was very much more experiential, Second Great Awakening kind of thing. There was pushback on that, obviously, and the Missouri Synod and others who came over for religious reasons were very much more old Lutherans who were, we're going to be very strict. We're going to speak out against every Reformed threat and Catholic threat that's out there. The guys who started the Wisconsin Synod wanted to be a little milder. They weren't as theologically trained. They had come out of mission houses back in Germany.
So you say not as theologically trained. Would you also say not as theologically sound, or?
Correct.
Okay.
I think that partly for a lack of training. They just didn't dig into the dogmaticians of the 17th century. They may or may not have actually studied the Lutheran confessions, probably not. But they had learned enough basic Lutheran teaching, and even sometimes there it might have been Lutheran and, what did Lutheran and Reformed have in common? That's what we want you to be. That's what those mission houses often were training people to do, so you could serve both Lutheran and Reformed. And so a number of the...
So what you're saying is the mission houses in Germany are part of this concerted effort by Germans to kind of amalgamate, if you will, the Reformed and Lutherans together?
Yeah, kind of.
Okay.
These mission societies and mission houses got formed. One reason was to preserve biblical Christianity, basic biblical Christianity, against the inroads of rationalism, which was throwing out everything, all teachings that don't make sense. The other was to further the work of the gospel, to train missionaries. And so some of our forefathers in the Wisconsin Synod, they had gone into these mission houses kind of with the idea, I want to go to Africa or India. Instead, they got sent to America because we got a whole lot of German immigrants who are sheep without shepherds. And so we need shepherds over there. And so Johannes Mühlhäuser first he's actually in New York City or New York, upstate New York, Rochester for about 10 years before he hears. For a couple other guys come over, they go to America, they send word back to him and say, boy, we could use your help here. And so he resigns his call in Rochester and moves to Milwaukee, and eventually starts Grace Lutheran Church downtown Milwaukee in 1849, I believe it was, or 48. And then the three of them, there's three guys who basically get the Wisconsin Synod started in 1850, and kind of seeing themselves as an alternative to the old Lutherans, because there were some Missouri Synod and Buffalo Synod congregations in the area already, but also, traveling, communication's hard in those days, so we couldn't be that. He had friends in the East, but he kind of felt the need to start his own thing. You weren't going to, Mühlhäuser did in particular, you weren't going to start, the Western Pennsylvania Synod, because that's a long ways away right now, and transportation and communication's hard. It is interesting, though. Professor Tim Grunmeyer from Martin Luther College recently, I don't know if you read his article in the most recent quarterly.
I haven't.
I encourage you to read the spring quarterly. He wrote a rather large article on how the Wisconsin Synod was really kind of looked to the Pennsylvania Synod, which was the oldest Lutheran church body in America dating back to the 1740s, and the largest at the time. In 1850, it was larger than Missouri Synod yet. That they almost kind of took us under their wing. We saw them as our mother in many ways. They saw us as their daughter, and they supported us financially for about, I'd say 15 to 18, about 18 years, 17, 18 years, and much needed at the time.
Yeah.
But there came a time where we recognized, and this had been occurring slowly over the course of those 15 years or so, starting to see some of the, well, maybe I should put, maybe it's more starting to appreciate more the doctrinal integrity, maybe is a good way of putting it, of the Missouri Synod and those old Lutherans, as opposed to the, I mean, Pennsylvania was, for an Eastern Lutheran Church body, was much more confessional than some of the others, and certainly what was going on in Gettysburg. In fact, that's why they started their own seminary in Philadelphia in 1864, I think it was, as an kind of an opposition seminary to Gettysburg. Ironically, now the two campuses have merged in their one seminary. But Philadelphia, so there was a conservative element or a confessional element in Pennsylvania that was stronger. But again, kind of the distance, and I think also just there were certain questions that Pennsylvania, those Eastern Lutherans weren't answering in an acceptable way for the growing confessionalism in the Wisconsin Synod. I don't know if I've answered the question.
Yeah.
It's kind of gone,
no, that's great.
Gone adrift, I think. I don't know.
That's great. So I guess it sounds like the need being addressed by these early Lutheran church bodies in America is that there are a lot of Germans here. There are a lot of Lutherans here. And if we don't get them pastors, they're not going to be Lutheran anymore, or they're looking for a Lutheran pastor. What's life like for these people when they come over here?
Very challenging. You're trying to, in some cases, it's subsistence living. You're clearing land. You're trying to get your farm going, or you're trying to find a job somewhere. It's challenging, and a lot of them. I mean, in some ways, some people will say, "Well, how much of this was really mission work back in those?" I think a lot of it was, though, because a lot of them. They were nominally Lutheran. I mean, because that's just what you were in the state church, and now they get here, and all of a sudden they decide we don't have to go to church. We don't have to contribute. My taxes don't pay for the church. Now all of a sudden I have to. It's volunteerism more, and so that takes some adjusting, and that takes the work of a pastor to gather them together. There were always the concerns that the Methodists were going to sweep in and get all these immigrants if we didn't do something. That was always a concern if there weren't Lutheran pastors to help or to serve. So that's kind of constantly the challenge. It's just a shortage of pastors and a shortage of money too, because it takes a while to train up people to realize they have to give free will offerings. That takes a bit to figure out.
Yeah.
How do you encourage people to do that?
Yeah. Well, it seems to continue to be a challenge for the church today.
Yeah, I would say, we've come a long ways as far as our circles are concerned, WELS is concerned. Being here at the seminary, I'm floored sometimes by the generosity of God's people. The gifts that come in, for example, the financial assistance for you guys is just incredible. And when you think about some of the methods that were used in the past, President Schrader mentioned it in his talk at the luncheon back about a month ago. When he got to his church, they still printed all the names of everybody along with what they gave. Scandal sheets and things like that, or trying to say everybody owes, you owe this much money, that kind of thing, rather than out of what the Lord has given you, you give a percentage. That takes a while to teach. When I was a parish pastor, I never knew what people gave. I never looked that kind of stuff up, but every once in a while I had to help the ushers sort the offering at the end of church, and so you'd see what people wrote on the front of their envelopes, and when you saw numbers like $173, you knew that was somebody who was practicing percentage giving and had taught.
And 26 cents.
Doing that very strict, which is great that they're that thoughtful. They were that thoughtful in that. But it just took a while for that to happen. Yeah. And so that was always a struggle, especially in those early years.
Yeah. What other cultural issues faced throughout the history of the Lutheran Church? What other, in America particularly, what other cultural issues do they face?
Well, there was a language issue. I mean, especially, Wisconsin Synod Lutherans, WELS, we were primarily German into the 1920s.
When you say primarily German, do you mean language-wise or nationality, or I guess heritage? I don't know how you would say that.
Well, I would say, first of all, language, both in the church and even in synodical, publications. We didn't have an English language publication until 1914.
Wow, 1914.
And I don't remember when the English publication surpassed the German one as far as numbers are concerned, but that didn't happen until I think the 30s or 40s.
It's striking to me that 1914 is kind of the height of not the American involvement in World War I, but it is kind of the height of World War I.
That's when World War I starts.
Okay.
1914.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I thought,
Nope, 1914 to 1918.
1914 and 1918.
Don't argue with it.
I'm not arguing. Okay. Anyway, yeah. So are those two things related?
I wouldn't. No.
Okay.
In fact, the Northwestern Lutheran, I think, might have actually gotten started before World War I actually broke out.
Yeah. Okay.
But it was the recognition that English is becoming necessary if we're going to reach out and be an American Lutheran church body. And so that you started to have that happen, and I've always admired the pastors who served in those decades. I would say the 19-teens, 20s, and even into the 30s in some places. They were carrying out truly bilingual ministry. And I know that is not easy. I got to write my sermon in English and I got to translate it in German or vice versa, and preach it in both languages on the same Sunday. My brother does that with Hispanic work. In fact, I've heard him preach bilingual sermons. I don't know how he does it personally, but my mind would be spinning. And so, having to do that, and I think that was a big challenge, and having to break out from the idea that we are just this German, just for Germans. That takes a while for that to start changing, and it changes especially as we start churches in places that are not just German enclaves. But I mean, the initial beginnings of Wisconsin Synod in Wisconsin, I mean, there's just Germans everywhere. And so you have that audience, I think, that initial audience. You talk about, the economics of things, I want to kind of back to your question, what was life like for some? There's one interesting layman, the story of a guy named George Brumder. So he comes to America in the early 1850s, really accompanying his sister, who's engaged to. In fact, he had two sisters that married early Wisconsin Synod pastors. In fact, both of those pastors, for brief times, were presidents of the Wisconsin Synod. But George Brumder, first he works clearing land in Helenville, out near Watertown. Then he gets a job. I forget if he comes to Milwaukee, and I forget what job he gets. But then he decides to get into the print industry. Ends up saving up enough money to buy a printing press. He eventually becomes like his German newspaper is the most popular German newspaper in America. I mean, Wow. He becomes the printing guru of German language stuff in America. In fact, there's a building still in downtown Milwaukee, the Germania building, which was his building.
Okay.
And he was a strong supporter of Grace downtown, but he was the Synod's first publisher.
Yeah.
This guy knew presidents. He stayed at the White House. He knew Roosevelt and Taft. And he gave the first major gift to build what became the new gymnasium, which is today the auditorium at Luther Prep School in the Watertown campus. He died before that building was completed. But when that building was dedicated in 1912, President William Howard Taft sent a congratulatory telegram to the Northwestern College president on the new building.
Wow.
And it's got to be because Brumder had all those connections, national connections. So it's just kind of interesting how a lay guy who came to America because he was accompanying his unmarried sister to get married to a Wisconsin Synod pastor and becomes this significant figure.
Yeah. Yeah. These stories are fun, right? Why is it important that you mentioned just seeing the hand of God at work from one generation to the next. But again, you can see that kind of from any angle, right? You can see that in the study of the early church. You can see that in Reformation history. Why is it? Because you guys have made the anniversary committee has made a large and concerted effort to preserve and even promote some of these stories of the early church. And you brought a book with you too that you guys are publishing. Why is it so important to preserve specifically our history as a synod? I mean, even like the synod archives and things like that are quite impressively curated. Why is that such a big piece of our culture?
Well, I think part of it is a matter of identity. You asked the question before, how do we present ourselves in America today? And I think helping people see that we have a history. We're not a fly-by-night thing. We have some roots that we can trace, and we can see God's hand working, and we can talk about that. And I think that's a good thing, to appreciate God's work among us. And each of us individually, we each have our own history. And how has God worked in our past so that we are here today as a believing child of God? You look back at your past and say, oh, okay, that person, somebody invited him to church. Or whatever it might be. There's all sorts of, who knows how far back you have to go. And then it just gets passed down from generation to generation, which is a blessing too. But I think just, again, seeing God's hand, God working for us and through us, and the privilege we have, again, we're just one small segment of the larger Holy Christian Church, but we are one small segment. And I think that's something worth talking about.
Yeah.
And remembering and appreciating, giving thanks for, and learning lessons from. We can learn lessons from that too.
Yeah.
I think of, back in 1961, we broke from Missouri, and that was traumatic on many different levels. And one concern people had was, well, is this going to be the end of the Wisconsin Synod? Are we going to go off into our little Orthodox corner and not do anything? At the time, we were in 16 states. We had two overseas missions. 20 years, just over 20 years later, we were in all 50 states, and we had overseas missions in, I think, close to 10 countries, a dozen countries. The Lord showed us we could stand on our own. And so now all of a sudden, we broke away from Big Brother, Missouri, but now how much more ministry was able to get done. And so we look at take that, fast forward that to today, and we look at demographics, and we can start wringing our hands a little bit. But instead, maybe we say, let's start 100 missions in 10 years. And let's see, what other world mission opportunities is the Lord presenting to us? And maybe we can actually do this. And by the Lord's help and his grace, he gives us the strength to do it. And where that's going to go, I don't know. Who knows? One of the questions you posed to me beforehand is, what do you see the future? Where you see it going? I don't know. I'm not sure. I can't. It's the beauty of a historian. You look at the past, not the future, maybe. But
yeah.
But,
well, why don't you tell us about the book?
Sure. Well, two books have been published with this anniversary. One is Professor Brenner taking a book that sainted Professor Edward Frederick had written back in 1992, called the Wisconsin Synod Lutherans, and he has updated it. And so he's added 2 chapters to bring it to the present, and made a few other changes that had to be fixed otherwise. But the Wisconsin Synod Lutherans, the second edition, is now out. Is this showing up on the...
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay. So that one has just come out. But the other bigger project was this pictorial history book called Christ Through Us. John Brown and I were the co-authors, but very much a team effort. We had a great team of people on the design side. Susan Willems, our Synod archivist, she and I did a lot of work on finding photos and everything. And so this is an effort to tell the story of the Wisconsin Synod visually. A lot of the maybe kind of human interest kind of stories, telling it in a popular fashion that might be more appealing to lay people. I would say the Frederick book's a little more academic in nature or scholarly in nature than ours. You're not going to see footnotes in this one, and all that kind of stuff. So, but a way to tell that story in a way that maybe hopefully will be appealing to people, and again, be able to maybe see what's our identity, that history helps us see our identity, helps us appreciate, maybe help people appreciate what God has done through the Wisconsin Synod, for the Wisconsin Synod, for them, through the Synod, through his work in the Synod, and maybe just appreciate a little bit more and find maybe inspiration for the future as well.
Where can we find the book if we want to
Northwestern Publishing House has it available. I think the cost is $29.99. So actually, it's subsidized because this one will run you about 50 some.
Okay.
But this one is $29.99.
Yeah. Awesome.
And they're available, but they're in limited quantities. So if you want to order one,
yeah. So we'll make sure there's a link in the show notes for those two books.
Sure.
We still have some time, but I want to make sure I get to these couple of questions.
Okay.
What challenges do you see as the biggest challenges facing the Lutheran Church in America? See, what's the difference? So there's not the ELCA, obviously.
Maybe say the Confessional Lutheran.
Confessional Lutherans in America. What's the biggest challenge, would you say, facing us today?
Probably two things. One is, I think, a demographic thing when it comes to congregations. So many a lot of congregations, we skew older, and there have not been as many births recently and baptisms, infant baptisms, which I think is across the board. I don't think it's just Lutherans that are struggling with this, but I think as a church body as a whole, society as a whole, I think that's an issue. But it's going to affect the church too, of course, and so declining numbers and things like that, and which is forcing congregations to face some realities. Can we afford to remain open? Can we afford to have a pastor? And so maybe start to look at what do we do? Close, merge, so those are some challenges. I think you always have the challenge that confessional Lutheranism in America has had to deal with, is that we're not like the generic Protestant religion of America. We just aren't. And so we're a different voice. We're sometimes perceived as a foreign voice, maybe. And I think that's still the same, that this Lutheran Church has struggled with in America for 200 years or more. So that's not really anything new. I think a lot of it's maybe the demographic thing a little bit more. That's why I think it's important that we continue to be who we are. I mean, we can be a different, when you talk about the marketplace of religion, well, let's be who we are. I think there's something to be said for that.
Yeah. What about the opposite of that? What are your hopes? I obviously can't ask you to predict the future, but what are your hopes and dreams for the Lutheran Church, the confessional Lutheran churches in the United States in the future?
Well, I think that we continue to, I'm going to sound like maybe a broken record player.
It's okay.
Of course,
cliches are cliches.
Does your
for a
generation
reason.
understand that? No.
Yeah, maybe. I do. I don't know if everybody does.
Right. Let's just keep being who we are. Let's not be afraid of that. Let's not be afraid of looking like who we are. I sometimes get a little concerned when I see guys start to look more evangelical than non-evangelical than confessional Lutheran in what they look like on Sunday morning, for example. Let's teach the catechism. Let's preach sola gratia, grace alone, faith alone, scripture alone. Let's be unapologetically sacramental in our piety and understand what that means and looks like. Let's not be afraid to do that and be that. And trust the power of the Spirit to get his work done when we're faithful to his word. And so, when I see 100 missions and, that we have a goal to shoot for. We're not trying to contract, even though there's going to be churches, congregations that close, yet we're looking for new opportunities, both here in America and abroad. And that we maintain, particularly in WELS, our ministerial education system. I just think that is a true blessing that sometimes we maybe take for granted.
And very unique to us.
Yes. The fact that we have this system that we do, prep schools. I would even take it all the way down to our Lutheran elementary schools, which very much are kind of, when you look at the makeup of our student body here, the vast majority of you guys have gone to a Lutheran grade school or at least a Lutheran high school prep school. Mm-hmm. So you have that background, and that's kind of where you've been recruited in a way and encouraged along the way. I'm optimistic, at least in the near future. We've got several classes, at least here at Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary. This year's class was smaller, but we've got 3 larger ones coming up, which I think will make a dent in the vacancy challenges we have.
And even some of the smaller classes coming through, they end up being smaller by the time you're done, but they're not necessarily discouraging from the start. Is that accurate? Like, for example, the class that just graduated is only about 25 guys. But they weren't always 25 guys. Like, there are other factors that play a role in that, and COVID certainly is not the least of those factors. And things.
Yeah, I think I forget what this class started with. I think they started in the low to mid 30s, maybe.
Like, there's always going to be some attrition in a training system like this. You think about it, the same thing is true, like whether it's military training or doctoral training or whatever it is, there's always going to be some that don't finish what they start. And that's to be expected.
Right. So, yeah, and that's a good way of looking. I sometimes have to maybe appreciate that, because sometimes we can get discouraged at the seminary. Oh, man, another guy had to leave. But yeah, there is that always going to be, I think, some of that attrition, right?
Yeah. Well, I think what the point I was getting at was, like, even when you have some classes like this particular one, it just seems to be a higher percentage of guys that there was just a higher attrition rate than we normally see. But they started in an okay spot, like at MLC, and things happen along the way. Right. So there's still guys being recruited to the process, at least, of becoming ministers, which is always encouraging. That people are interested and willing to put in the work.
Right, and guys who discontinue often become really good laymen.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. All right, you've got a vast library in your head, I'm sure, of stories about the synod and members of the synod and lay people in the synod and ministers in the synod and so forth. What are a few stories, just with the time we have left, what are some stories from synod history that you think are particularly applicable for today, maybe, or valuable for us to hear today, or maybe just like valuable stories that ought to be told about, like, from our history?
When you asked that, when I saw that question in the email, I'm like, does he want like the big turning point kind of things at the synod?
That's up to you.
Or
what do you think?
I can tell it more. I don't know if it's personal family history that intertwines with it. Because I told this story at I was the presenter at the banquet we had, our anniversary banquet, about a few weeks ago, and it came from Pastor Justin Dauk, who's a pastor out in Plymouth, Nebraska, who just got his Master of Sacred Theology degree.
Okay.
And his project, it was in church history, and his project was writing on a relative that we actually both share, a guy named Ludwig Nietmann. Nietmann was.
I wonder if that guy's German.
Yeah. Well, he was an early pastor in the Wisconsin Synod. But he was a real piece of work. I mean, he's an example of the struggles that the Synod had early years of finding qualified, well-trained pastors, because he was neither. But he somehow managed, but desperate times call for desperate measures sometimes. And so you had a congregation. This guy was the teacher in the school at St. John's on 68, which is today 68th and Forest Home. And when their pastor had to retire or left or something, the congregation said, well, this guy's teaching. He seems to be doing okay in the classroom. Let's have him be the pastor. So they approached the synod, and the synod said, okay, he needs to do these things, start this kind of study, and we'll ordain him, and he could be your pastor. And then he takes a call to Newtonburg. St. John's up in Newtonburg near Manitowoc, and then his past catches up to him. Turns out he had been imprisoned in Germany for a bit. When he came to America, in Buffalo, he was convicted of stealing pigs, and I think he moved his family to Milwaukee or to Wisconsin to escape one step ahead of the law kind of thing. Turns out in America or in Wisconsin, then he's like stole a Christmas tree from a cemetery. He came up and so he gets booted out of basically he has to sign a document saying, I resign my call because of my character issues. I will leave the Wisconsin. He basically gets excommunicated from the Wisconsin Synod. But he manages to worm his way into some other Lutheran churches, including one up in Kewanee, the Emmanuel Lutheran in Kewanee, which today is Wisconsin with WELS Church, but then it was still not affiliated with the Synod. And while he's up there, he starts to meddle in other congregations. He kind of tries to start his own synod. He preaches for lodge stuff. He's preaching in the Methodist Church and the Baptist Church. I mean, he is just, his name becomes an adjective. Neatmanist influences, a guy who's just a problem. Eventually, the folks at Emmanuel Kiwani have enough with him by 1879, I think it was, 78. They boot him out. And actually, the pastor who replaces him to straighten everything out up there is a seminary graduate who gets assigned there by the name of August Pieper. Anyway, the reason why I tell this story is so Neatman has one of his daughters settles in the Kiwani area. She has a daughter who marries a farmer named Otto Stibbs, or Steebs, S-T-U-E-B-S. Otto and Lydia, so this is Lydia, she would have been Neatman's granddaughter. They have 13 children. One of them is named Edna, and Edna wanted to serve and take care of babies of color. So she went to get some training and ended up going down to the Apache reservation to work in the nursery. And who should pick her up from the stagecoach or train station or whatever it was, and to take her to drive her to the Apache reservation, but a young, recently graduated from the seminary young man by the name of Rudolph Otto. Those are my grandparents. Another child of that Otto and Lydia Stibbs family was a man named Arden, who went and became a pastor. Well, Arden's great-grandson walked by the hall just before Jacob Kieselhorst. So you talk about personal family, personal stories, personal history, intertwined with the Wisconsin Synod's history. It's just stuff like that I find. Now, that story isn't in the book, but I think a lot of people maybe have similar, kind of interesting stories. But you just see God's hand. How could it be anything but God's grace? I mean, to just a guy who was he wasn't a good pastor. He wasn't. But from that family, I mean, how many? I'd have to start doing the math. And Justin Dowk then comes from a different line of the Neatman. But still, you've got all these pastors and teachers and lay people who've been part of congregations in the Wisconsin Synod and have served in different ways, and just kind of neat to think about.
Yeah. This is a little bit of a redundant question and is going to sound a little silly maybe coming out of a seminarian's mouth. But you paint a picture of, like, this is our church, right? Like, in a very real way. Like, my family's got very similar stories for generations. There's a church in Kenosha, which is now New Life, but it was Frieden's. It's well over 100, maybe even 150 years straight, where there was an ungemak on the register, right? And they tell stories about the older generation when I was a kid would tell stories about, like, the pastor going down to the docks, and when passenger ships would come in, he would go down there with a mule and a wagon, and he'd ring a bell and just yell, German church, and that's how they got new members.
Sure.
Is all the people that got off the ship and spoke German went and got in the wagon, and he drove them to the church, and they lived in the church basement until they could find places to live in town, and that's how they did mission work, right? Things like that. My favorite one, I actually have a receipt from the Charles Ungemak Cigar Factory for, I don't remember how many, I think it's 100 cigars for like $2 or something like that. But he sold the cigars to the church, and it's just made out to German Lutheran Church, but it's the right address and everything. And it's in his handwriting with his signature. With the other thing that's a little bizarre about that is you can see a similarity between, like, my dad's handwriting and my handwriting and my great-great-grandfather's handwriting, which is just mind-blowing. Anyway, the legend goes that at the time, the chairman of the congregation or president of the congregation, or whatever word they would use, the chairman of the board of elders probably, was a cigar smoker. And the way that they'd keep their meetings moving is, when you walked in, there would be, at this big conference table, there'd be a cigar at every place all the way around the table. And when the president lit his cigar, the meeting started. When he put out his cigar, the meeting ended, and you better get your business in while that cigar lasted. And they all just sat there and smoked cigars together during the meeting. So anyway, so there's stories like that, right? And this is our church body. This is our synod. Why is it so important then that we be taking our church body and our synod and pressing it out into the world and bringing other people into it? Why are we making other people? Why is it our goal to make more people Lutheran?
I think it goes back to your comments earlier. What is at the heart of confessional Lutheranism? It is the only message that saves. It is a message that gives true comfort and peace and hope and forgiveness in a world that desperately needs all of that. And you kind of need a house for that, right? I mean, you aren't just, it isn't an abstract thing. You need a concrete house. Maybe that's a way of thinking of it, to invite people to.
Yeah.
And so this is the house that we are. This is who we are. This is what we are. And most importantly, it's what we proclaim, what we are here to, by God's grace and God's working, we get to be his messengers of this. And it is a humble privilege that we get to do that. And so it comes with some baggage at times. It comes with a history, which I don't think is a bad thing, to know that history. Even if you're a brand new Christian in South Carolina or something like that, who wonders, what is this Wisconsin Evangelical, this WELS Wisconsin Evangelical? Why the Wisconsin? Well, there's some history there. Let me tell you about it. And maybe it's something you want to be part of. But most importantly, it's because the gospel is being proclaimed.
Amen. Amen. If I was going to put
I didn't even think I mentioned South Carolina, and that's.
Well, he's holding the call, so we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. Maybe you're going somewhere else.
I really want to go to South Carolina,
I'm
but
sure.
wherever the Lord decides, wherever the Lord and the men in charge decide.
Yeah.
Put it in my own words. The reason I'm so proud to be a Lutheran is, one, I recognize what I'm blessed enough to be able to look at my family history, as are you, and see what the people that came before me went through and the sacrifices they made so that they could stand on the truth and never compromise it. Who am I to ruin that legacy by compromising the truth?
That's a good way of looking at it.
Yeah. Awesome.
And the Neatman thing is just why my grandfather, I'm teaching some of the same classes he taught here. Armin should see.
Yeah.
So
cool.
It is kind of a cool thing and humbling.
Yeah.
Who am I that I should be doing this? But
I think about that almost every time I walk. It's one of the reasons why I walk the path that I do around campus, so that I can walk back through the arch every morning, and sometimes a couple times a day, and just look up at the arch and go, how on earth did I get here? And by the grace of God, go I. So awesome. Thank you very much for your time, Professor. Welcome back to the States. I'm surprised. You hinted that you got a little sun, but for a guy that just got back from Zambia, actually, maybe not as much sun as well, I suppose it's winter over there.
It is winter over there. We were in although it's still, I'll take their winter 9 days out of 10. I mean, it was sunny and 75, and it got down to maybe 55 at night, but the weather there at this time of the year is beautiful. Yeah. But we were mostly indoors in meetings, so I wasn't sitting out in the sun too much.
Yeah.
But
all right, well, we will make sure that we link all kinds of stuff in the show notes, to the books, to the 175th anniversary stuff, to the seminary also, and of course the Girt Up links will be down there as well. Please consider helping support the work that we do here at Girt Up. Thank you to those of you who do already. Dean Otto, thank you very, very much for your time. It's a joy to sit down and chat with you for a while. You finally got to be on the podcast.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me on, Charlie.
Yeah. All right. God bless all of you. We love you, and we'll talk to you next week.